Okay, so let's continue talking about some other types of changes in communities that can occur that can affect those communities. One of the big things, other than succession change over time, is whenever we start taking species out of communities, and whenever we start doing the reverse and adding species into communities, that can have a pretty big effect on the life that's there and how those communities operate. So, over short periods of times, these disturbances can be adapted to, but over long periods of times, um, it just depends on the type of disturbance that happens, what species are being taken out, what species are being put in, and what effect they have based on what role they play in that ecosystem. So, two types of changes in communities would be removal of species, and the other one is going to be the addition of species. So let's talk about removal of species. So when we talk about removing a species from an ecosystem, one of the big concepts we have to talk about is something called a keystone species. So you've probably heard the term keystone before, like the old Roman arcs that the Romans are famous for building architecture and then building these arcs. And at the top, there's a stone that holds up either side of the arc. If this stone is removed, the arc will collapse. This is what we call the keystone. And in this diagram, we have some different species that are put in the different stones, and the salmon are in the middle. The salmon is a keystone species. If you remove it, well, then the bears and the eagles have nothing to eat. And then the populations of birds and mice start to skyrocket. And that's going to start affecting humans. And that's going to start affecting the amount of insects. And so forth and so on, down to what we call an ecosystem catastrophic cascade failure. And ecosystems will just collapse because of the removal of one species. Generally speaking, a keystone species is any species that when it's removed, that another species cannot fill the role that it played in that ecosystem. Salmon are a huge food source for tons of different animals. If they were removed, there's not another species out there that can fill that role. In some cases, you can remove species that aren't considered keystone species, and some other species can fill that role. So they're just not. We don't want to remove them, but it's still they're not considered a keystone species. So another good example of a keystone species is wolves in Yellowstone Park. So what happened is that in Yellowstone Park, which is up in, I believe, the southwestern corner of Montana, there's a lot of farming areas that are right next to the park. And the wolves that are in the park, it was a lot easier for those wolves to eat the cattle than it was to catch elk. So the farmers started complaining, hey, these wolves are eating our cattle. And so a big motion was started and won, and they removed this wolves from Yellowstone National Park. And what happened is we saw a systematic cascade effect of ecosystem failure. So the wolves normally eat the elk. Well, elk population started going up really high because there's no more wolves to control the population. And so elk normally would feed on grasses and shrubs in certain areas, where there are so many of the elk that they started feeding on other things as well. And there's a type of vegetation that grows along the riverside. It's called riparian. It's just a term for riverside vegetation. But the elk started eating that. It's not something they normally eat, but they were starving. There wasn't enough food to go around because there's so many of them, because there weren't any wolves anymore to keep their numbers under control. So they started eating the riverside vegetation. They started eating the riparian. Well, the riverside vegetation is what holds the stream banks together. So when that was gone, the stream started to erode a lot more, and the water became full of silt and sand and mud, and it made the water go from clear to dirty. And the fish that live in those streams, the trout, needed clear water in order to spawn their eggs. And so the amount of trout in the water started going down drastically. And so when the farmers who complained about the wolves went to Yellowstone Park to go fish recreationally, there wasn't any fish. They were finding fewer and fewer of the species that they liked, and they started to complain, well, what's going on? And the park said, well, we took the wolves out of Yellowstone National Park and we removed a keystone species. And it's a great example of a cascade effect when you remove that one species. No other species there could fill the role of the wolf. So what happened? Well, they put the wolves back in Yellowstone Park. So what happened to the number of elk? It went down. What happened to the riverside vegetation? It started growing back. What happened to the quality of the water? It cleared up. What happened to the trout? They returned. And, wolves sometimes sneak out still and we'll take a couple of cattle here and there. But for the most part, we were able to see very, very clearly the effects of removing species from an ecosystem, because the ecosystem depends on pretty much all of its players in order to work properly. So that's taking species out. The other type of change you can do to an ecosystem is to introduce new species. Species that are not native to an area are called invasive species. Sometimes you may have heard the term exotic species. It kind of goes hand in hand, but the technical term, the sciencey term, is an invasive species. So in Mississippi, we have tons of invasive species. I think most people would probably recognize this plant over here. This is a kudzu. And that's mostly north of Jackson. We have kudzu problems. South of Jackson, here on the Gulf Coast, we actually have kogon grass, which is an invasive species that's taking over. We also have, here's another good example, are nutria rats. Nutria rats were brought in the 1800s into Louisiana from South America because they thought, hey, these are bigger than muskrats. They're very closely related to muskrats. But they brought them in. They said, hey, these are bigger than muskrats. We'll bring them to the area. We can get more fur for them, or from them to sell, and we'll raise them here and just sell these for fur, and we'll get more money. And a hurricane came through, like they do, and it destroyed the feeble little structure they were keeping these in, and a group of nutria rat escaped into the swamps of Louisiana. The nutria rat is more aggressive than its cousin that's local, the muskrat, and so it outcompetes the muskrat. Well, nothing really eats nutria. Sometimes a gator may take it, but for the most part, not really. Our ecosystem had not evolved with nutria rats in the ecosystem, so it didn't know how to handle them. And as a result, the population of nutria has skyrocketed, and they've spread. They spread to Texas, they spread all over Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and now places in Florida are having nutria rat problems. For us, the big problem is they get out on the barrier islands, the Horn Island, Ship Island, Petty Boy, East and West Ship, and also Cat Island, and the Chandeliers, and they go through and they eat the sea oats. The sea oats is a type of seaside grass that grows, and the roots of the sea oat actually hold the island together. It's what allows sand to build up and form the actual mass of the island. Well, the nutria rats are eating all of that. They're eating all of the sea oats, and so we see that some places in the island are starting to erode away. Well, what happens when a hurricane comes through? The barrier islands are called that because they block. They're as a barricade between the open ocean and the actual Gulf Coast. The sound is in between. And once the islands are gone, if they erode away, the coast of Mississippi is going to change drastically. We're going to get a lot more wave action, and when hurricanes come through, we're going to see a lot more storm surge and a lot more destruction from those storm systems, simply because an invasive species numbers took off and they were destructive to the environment because they didn't evolve here. They're not meant to be here. Kudzu was brought in, and kogon grass were both brought in to help control erosion around work sites, because kudzu and kogon grass grow extensive root systems into the ground. But the problem is nothing here eats it. There's no natural predators in this environment to help keep its numbers in check. Kudzu grows about a foot a day, and it takes over. You can see from this picture, it takes over, and it smothers out the natural vegetation. Same thing for kogon grass. Kogon grass it grows so thick and so dense that it just smothers out all the other wildflowers and baby trees that are in an area, and so it completely takes over a field. And it becomes what we call a monoculture of kogon grass, to where the only species in this area is kogon grass. And that's not good, because lots of different flower species and tree species, when they're small especially, it's very easy for kogon grass to choke them out, to keep them from getting sunlight, and it kills them. People say, well, just keep it mowed down low and it won't reproduce. Yes, it will. It'll still send up a little flowering stalk of seeds and reproduce even when it's short. people try to go through and burn it out. The wildlife places that are forestry places rather that do burning periodically call kogon grass. They call it dynamite grass because it burns so much hotter than regular grass that it actually sterilizes the seeds that are in the soil, so so that no other species seeds are viable now. So nothing else can grow up, but the kogon grass can still grow because its roots go so far in the ground and so extensively a network of roots in the ground that it doesn't actually kill the kogon grass. It burns back the blade, but it doesn't kill the plant. So the kogon now grass grows back with no competition from any other species because all of the seeds that could have grown are now sterilized because of the fire and how hot it burned. So those are three good examples of invasive species in just our area that have taken over. Zebra mussel shells are another great example of an invasive species. They've gotten into pretty much most of the waterways in the U.S. They're actually species from Asia. They're called the zebra mussels because they're little bivalves that are striped, black and white stripes. They look like zebras, but they're tiny. And they came over here on the ballast of a ship. Or they came here on a ship essentially, and when the ship emptied its ballast tank, the mussels got out. They grow extremely well here, but they're small and they grow on top of our native bivalve shells, and it smothers them out. And they grow on ships, and when the ships move from port to port, it just gets transported around, and so forth and so on. And it's become a big problem because their numbers are not being kept in check because there's no natural predators here to keep them in check. So again, those are some great examples of invasive species and the two types of changes that we can do in environment where we actually remove species and then add species back in and how that can affect and change an ecosystem.